Hi, Carl here for ProAV TV, and today we're talking to Jeremy Humphries. This is before we're going to do a bit of a Sony open day on sensor sizes and all that sort of stuff. But just before we got started with all that, I thought it would be worthwhile to sit down and have a bit of a chat.
Great.
So, firstly, thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Thank you for giving up your time.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
I think a natural starting place is a little bit about yourself, a bit about your career so far. So, when did you get started with all of this?
Well, it all started a long time ago. I used to make little Super 8 home movies when I was back as a teenager, which is a few years ago now. And it's great to be here in this building today at ProAV, because as I drove up this morning, I saw I was actually driving up Eastman Way. So Kodak, Eastman, is where I used to actually send my little Super 8 cartridges all those years ago. And a little yellow envelope, I remember, sending it to the Eastman Kodak processing department, where it was all sorted out and sent back, and used to get 3 minutes 20 back of film, which you put into an edit machine, and you could scratch it or you could damage it. You had to be very careful. But that's where it all began. And I used to have, as a sort of 12, 13-year-old, little film shows every year for all my family. And I used to love the fact, whatever the film was and however bad it was, and I'm sure they were bad, there was an engagement. There was an actual interest in what I was doing. And it was probably politeness as much as anything. But I think even then a seed was sown that you could sort of engage people by showing them a little bit of a movie film, at that point going through the camera at 18 frames a second. And I was interested in wildlife at that time as well, and we made some wildlife films at home, and we actually took them into the BBC when I was 17 or 18.
That's a difficult thing for a sort of home shooter on Super 8.
It was a progression from, it was Super 8 at that point, but they were very good and polite, and they looked at it in the BBC Natural History Unit boardroom, and they said, Jeremy, what you need is to actually go and get some professional experience on 16mm, as it was then, 16mm film, still Kodak. And I went off to film school, and this was the day and age when there was somebody there as a mentor looking after you, and the guy that had met me in that boardroom then came back towards the end of my course. I was 18 or 19, and said, Jeremy, we've got a job here in the Natural History Unit, working in the vaults, sorting out all the cans. Would you like the job? And I got in that way. And then from then it was a sort of natural progression across to the main film unit, where I did a year's apprenticeship with the BBC. I came back from Ealing, where they did the apprenticeship, back to Bristol, and I was then very soon sent out working as a focus puller, which I both loved and hated. I hated it because just getting it right, getting your depth of field right, and getting in focus with some bossy American actor was always tricky. But when it worked,
this is narrative on the BBC.
This was the narrative, yeah, and it was drama, and it was big budget dramas. But at the same time, such was the way that the BBC operated, I was being given the opportunity to go out and do some filming, and that was on documentaries. So I was being sent off on film, 16mm film still, to Australia to make films about Aborigines. I remember I went to South Africa, Egypt. I was very lucky, and that started a passion that's never left me, one of doing documentary filmmaking and working with people. I love pointing a camera at someone and recording faithfully, I hope, what that person's actually going through at that particular point, an experience or whatever it might be. And that's
real
never
life
left
stories.
Me. Real life stories, and that's never left me. And more recently, my training company with Skills to Film, I've tried to look more in more detail as to why we're engaging, how are we engaging. So at the same time as filming, which I'm still very much a practicing DOP, I'm actually training people to actually use their camera to do what all of us are doing, which is just to tell stories. That's what I've been doing. And how do we do that? Well, we use light, particularly contrast. The human brain's programmed to respond to light and shade. We are stimulated when we see something of high contrast, or any contrast for that matter. Colour. We are engaged by colour, the complete warmth to blue sort of spectrum. Composition, how someone is framed. And something more laterally as well that we use in the photography process, one of depth of field, and how we can actually isolate whoever we're filming from the background, and how we can concentrate the audience's attention. So what I'm basically doing is on my training, I'm preaching what I practice with the actual filming. and I'm actually using those sort of components, if you like, of human engagement when I've actually got a camera on my shoulder. And that's lasted now all the way back to when I was doing my Super 8 films. I think even then, all those years ago when my family were watching it, there was something there that was engaging them. They couldn't necessarily react to, but subconsciously they were programmed to respond to, as in the light and the colour. So I'm still very much shooting documentaries. I've recently been doing something for the BBC. That's on the BBC at the moment, so BBC One. This Is My Song, which is about some sort of amateur, though talented, vocalists that recording their first solo for the first time, and they get a vinyl at the end, but they go through the whole music production. It was interesting because I shot it all on a Sony FS7, and with my camera choice at the moment, a lot of it's around sensors. And with those sensors, as we all know now, that choice at the beginning is crucial. There's a massive calling now to actually sort of use sensors in terms of the bigger ones. And the bigger ones are great. They get you the ability to have a shallow depth of field. You can film in low light. They give you amazing colour and dynamic range, this ability to record contrast, which is what I've been referring to. And they also give you the ability to film in log, so an even greater contrast range. So we chose FS7s on that particular production because it gave us all that flexibility and the ability, as I say, for the sensor to see all that amazing detail and the colour and so on and so forth. And unusually for me, I was lighting that particular production.
Oh, okay. So you don't normally...
I don't normally like... Well, my background at the BBC, where I lit interviews and stuff like that, but although I was a focus puller on drama, I never actually lit drama. Okay. My propensity now when I'm filming is to always use daylight. So I use daylight or available light, let's say that, wherever I can. So it might be a candle or it might be a window. And I'm actually, when I'm lighting with available light, I'm trying to make it look as natural as possible. Mm-hmm. So I would use the backlight. I would use the sun as a backlight. I wouldn't necessarily light somebody flat on. I would use it as a backlight or as a kicker or whatever. And when I'm lighting in my studio, as I was on This Is My Song, I use very much that sort of natural inclination that I would use available light for with my own artificial light. So there were no windows in the studio, but I used very strong backlights to just rim light people to separate them from the background. And I introduced a little bit of fill in the front as well. But when I am lighting, I'm trying to obviously make it as natural and as faithful as it can be. I'm not blasting people with light, and I think that's where the big sensors have been really useful. We can now film in lower light. Yeah. And we can also film in this sort of area of where we don't need to put lots of light on it, so it feels more natural in terms of, on my documentaries certainly, I can just film with the available light I've got. And if I can do that, if I can film in natural light that's just provided with me, I think the human sort of reaction, the human viewer reaction when they see it is also one of more engagement because it looks more natural. And that use of the available light is one of the main sort of course of sort of photography when I'm filming or when I'm training. I'm always stressing, just use the light you've got. And I now love with these sensors being able to film in low light, being able to use, you know, candlelight or being able to use whatever that light deems to be relevant to the story.
It's all about the story, isn't it?
It's about the story, it's about creating a story, and I've done something recently, a year or so ago, about living off-grid in Sweden, where a family had no electricity whatsoever.
Well, that definitely needs to feel natural.
They were natural, and we were filming that in February, before the sun was above the horizon, and we used to use candles. Yeah. But that was interesting, and it was very relevant to camera choice, because this is pre-FS7 days. This is the FS7 was around, but not quite as popular as it was now. So I used the C300. Mm-hmm. I used the C300 because it had a super 35mm sensor, and I knew I could film in low light. Yep. The problem I had was with the lenses not being quite fast enough, some of the zoom lenses, so I was using prime lenses. So prime lenses, a super 35mm sensor, enabled me to actually think, before I'd even set foot in Sweden, that I could cover the story. I saw the script, I saw it was, as I say, off-grid, Sweden, sun wasn't above the horizon, so those were the sort of tick boxes I was going through. It's interesting because now there's this evolution of we've got to stick to the big sensors. Do we? It's a good question. I mean, Sony now have the Z280 coming out, which is 3 sensors. Yep, 3 sensors available. It's 4K. Because they've got this 3 sensors, I think they call it the CMOS stack sensor, they've got this ability to be very good in low light. In fact, I have a colleague, she's just been working on a new series for Channel 4, working in kitchens, in low light in kitchens in the evening and at night. And she's been filming cockroaches and stuff running around. Hygiene in kitchens, I hasten to add.
Okay.
But she's been able to sort of work with those 3. They're only they're a half-inch sensor camera, but you've got 3 half-inch sensor cameras. But she's been working down at 18 dB, where I've never been before without noise. And
Absolutely, that's a lot of gain.
She's been getting away with it.
Yeah.
So that's got something to do with the sensors as well. In terms of depth of field, she's got a very fast lens. The lens is, I think it's 17 times, but also it's got a speed of roughly, I think, about 1.9. Now that goes totally contrary to my FS7 lenses, which are often 2.8. Yep. So again, then you've got the depth of field thing sort of taken care of, because if you've got a similar angle of view on one camera, f2.8, and a similar one on 1.9, you can do the maths, but even though it's a different size sensor, you can still get a reasonable shallow depth of field on the Z280. So we're at a sort of a junction at the moment in terms of camera choice, in terms of, the FS7 is a faithful friend, great pictures, but there are these other cameras coming into the system, which means that they might be an alternative. For me, a camera like the Z280 means I don't have to keep changing lenses. Lenses are always a little bit of an issue when I'm using my Super 35mm sensor.
Well, you mentioned you took a whole bunch of primes
for
a documentary shoot.
Absolutely, and in Sweden I was using 5 lenses.
Yeah.
Couple of zooms, but because they were limited in their focal length, and I was filming wildlife as well, we went off on reindeer hunt, then the shorter focal lengths were no good. So I had longer telephoto zooms as well.
And that's fantastic for quality.
Yeah.
It's definitely the best way to get the best results in terms of quality.
Yeah.
But in terms of convenience, in terms of covering off all the shots, stuff like that.
I couldn't then film in the evenings. You know, we had a little bit of light during the day, daylight, but in the evenings when that light completely went, we were down to candles.
Yeah.
And without putting lots of gain in to the sensor, it wasn't going to work. So I had to use the prime. So I had 5 different lenses.
Yep.
Now, there's an argument to say now if the Z280 had been around then, or a camera similar to that, and I was going back to Sweden, I could potentially have done it with one lens. And that's a huge selling point to me, to the production, to all the way through the sort of process, not having to change lenses when something critical happens.
Yep. Think of all the time you'd save, the budget you'd save just by going down to... Although the Z280 is still it's priced about the same point as the FS7. It's not just about the camera body, is it? It impacts every aspect of the production.
No, absolutely. And I think that it's just, as I say, we're at a crossroads, and that decision in terms of what camera we use for production, it's a very exciting time because there are these different options, but we don't necessarily need to go for the biggest one. There are other options available, and possibly even better alternatives. The other thing to have in the back of the mind as well is in terms of where we go with the sensor and the lenses is log. We are shooting now on log. The bigger sensor enables us to do that. But again, on the half-inch sensor, on the CMOS, on the 280, the Z280, we are being able to film log as well. I'm a fan of log. I think in extreme ranges of contrast it's very useful. Again, a bit like my big sensor comment a few minutes ago, I don't think it's necessarily the answer every time. I think these cameras, because of their sensor technology, can actually record a perfectly decent picture in custom. And log, with all its repercussions of having to apply a LUT, of having to expose slightly differently, of post in terms of grading and cost, isn't necessarily the requisite, the compulsory, the mandatory route that we have to take. One thing I have been doing of late is I'm very interested in hybrid log gamma.
Yes.
So HDR has this bracket of anything of a wide dynamic range. We can do log and go through the grading process and all the shooting paraphernalia that brings as well, like the LUT and exposing, or we can just shoot HLG. And I think HLG is sometimes forgotten. and I think it's a lovely compromise. It's slightly wider dynamic range than your SDR, but you don't need a lot and you don't need to grade it. And when I was at the BBC, we used to use it all the time, just helping on those highlights.
Well, it's a BBC technology.
It is BBC technology, and just helping on those highlights and giving you the ability to sort of give you a little bit more sort of dynamic range. And again, the 280 does the HLG and gives you that ability to actually sort of, just give you an in-between.
And as we move towards HDR broadcast, HLG is going to be what is used for all of that. And so, particularly when you're shooting documentaries and things like that, which might want to be re-brought back up at a later point, having it already in HLG is going to be beneficial.
It's going to be beneficial, and I think there's still a little bit of ignorance in terms of what all these things can do now. In terms of the decision-making process. I often hear back, Jeremy, we want to use such and such because it looks nice. And that's about as deep as it goes. And we can't work on that sort of level. It needs to go deeper and all the implications. And that's not their fault. The implications need to be explained more fully.
Absolutely. It goes back to what you were saying at the beginning. It's all about the story. It's about using the right techniques for what you're trying to achieve as a production in terms of what you're trying to tell your viewer.
Very much so, and on this shoot with the recording studio and with my colleagues' shoot recently on the restaurants, it is all about, as you say, the story. It is about actually recording faithfully what's going on in front of you, not being handicapped by the fact it's not bright enough.
No, you need to get that shot of a cockroach regardless of what it looks like, because it needs to be there for the edit. And it's not like you can ask the cockroach to do it again.
No, exactly. Yeah, no, absolutely. No, there's no second take syndrome. But I think also, where these cameras are going in the future, that freedom has to be there in terms of us as operators.
Yes.
But I think, as you're touching on with the HDR side, there's going to be a legacy, which I'm not sure has been correctly explained in terms of, as you quite rightly say, we might shoot HDR, we might shoot 4K. Because although we're not showing that now, we're not transmitting 4K necessarily now, it's there for the future. And what I've been impressed with all these 4K cameras is, even though I'm not necessarily transmitting 4K, is my ability to still get a better picture.
Oh, absolutely.
The resolution and the colour and so on and so forth.
4K downsampled to 1080p looks beautiful.
Tremendous.
Absolutely beautiful.
It
very,
looks
very
tremendous.
sharp.
So there's the legacy of being able to use it eventually in terms of 4K form, but even at the moment, I think that's not been totally explained to our customers as well at the moment, in terms of they're still thinking about shooting HD, and why should I spend money on a 4K sensor? What's that going to give me? Well, it's giving the legacy stuff, but even now, it's giving them a better looking picture. And for me as an operator on the FS7, for example, on my 4K sensor, I do occasionally use the center scan option. So this is another point back to the lenses, where if I am restricted by my focal length on the lenses, I can use the center scan. If I'm on a 35mm lens on I can punch in and get 70. That's really useful.
Sony are great at giving options like that, like their clear image zoom, which isn't in the FS7, but it's in things like the FS5. It's so useful for just, you may have a 50mm lens on, or a 600 if you're doing wildlife or something like that. You just need to get that little bit extra out of it. You do.
And what they've called, I think it's the FS7 they called when it came out, they called it an immersive experience. And everybody I talked to about, they say, what does it mean? Well, for me, and I think they would agree, they don't use it anymore, but I think they would agree then, is it puts the viewer, when they're looking at the footage, it puts the viewer where the camera is. It's almost like the camera's like that. The camera is recording what the human eye can see. And when the human eye can actually, when the camera rather can translate what the human eye can see in terms of the dynamic range, the colour, the resolution, then we are getting well down that road in terms of engagement. And that's what I am looking at in terms of camera. That's how I've moved so far from my Super 8 days, where I had no contrast. I had okay colours, the Kodak colours were great, but the sensor then came out on my early Digibeta cameras, and I didn't have a clue what a sensor was. People didn't talk about sensors. It was a light gathering piece of kit, but we didn't talk about them as we talk about them now, because now we realise how essential they are.
They are the film stock of the modern day.
They are the film stock of the modern day, and we've got a big circle, because originally that's what we wanted. We wanted to replicate the beautiful contrast and colours. But it's interesting. I mean, it's probably 15 years ago, and I was doing a documentary about for Channel 4 called Bad Behaviour, and there was a son and a mother relationship that was deteriorating. And in my DigiBeta days, which is when it was then, and again, we didn't even know what a sensor was. We'd heard about it, but it didn't have the necessity it has now. I was filming the mother against a very brightly lit window, and she was all dark in silhouette, but outside was completely burnt out. And for my storytelling ability, it was rubbish, because she was having a hard time in life. The reason why I wanted the window exposed outside was to see the lads playing football and having a nice time. Yeah. The lovely contrast between the two. I mean, who needs audio when you can have a shot like that?
Yeah, and then in order to achieve that, you would have had to blast light on her.
Blast the light, yeah.
You're never going to get to
look
an
ND on the window
and stuff like that. Exactly, yeah. Take time out of your documentary shoot to ND up a window.
I couldn't do it. And that's how I was limited.
Yeah.
And we were all limited then. Now I could do exactly the same shot, exactly the same situation. And I'd have the mother silhouette, but a bit of detail in her darker side, but also outside you see in the highlights the kids running up and down. Yeah. Now that's put in its most brutal form when it doesn't work, but now it does work. And that's what I'm looking at in the sensor, and that's where I want the technology to go. So in terms of the immersive experience, cost, yes, that's important. Efficiency, that's important. And all the stuff that follows on in post is important, the colouring, the grading and stuff. But for me, at the cutting face, the cold face, the cutting edge, I want it just to sort of record things as they are with the minimum amount of effort. But to be able to, if somebody's upset standing by a window, to be able to record all that in tonal detail.
Absolutely.
If I'm doing an interview...
And I think what's great about Sony's lineup at the moment is that there are tools of all different sorts of designs and things that are going to achieve exactly that. They all have really great dynamic range, light performance, colours, log, all the rest of it. So now that they've brought out things like the Z280, and you've already mentioned that you might have used that instead of some other cameras on other previous shoots. When do you think you're going to be reaching into the tool bag to get a Z280 for production, and when do you think you're going to be reaching to get an FS7 for production? Are you going to use one more over than the other? What do you think is going to be that decision-making process for you now?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, there's a genuine overlap between the two cameras. I mean, it is pretty hard to see when you put them up against each other.
I mean, the tech spec's very similar. They've got the same sort of codec in them, the same sort of resolutions, the same sort of logs and everything like that. Yeah, no, absolutely. They're very similar. And in terms of picture quality, great opportunities to have one as a second camera, maybe, whatever. Particularly when, cost or whatever comes in. But I think in terms of your question, in terms of my decision, it's going to come down to more basic stuff, like lenses. Yes.
I have got a greater range of lens, in terms of focal length, on my Z280 than potentially on the FS7. If I go down the FS7 to get the equivalent focal length range, I'm going to have a big heavy lens, CN7 or something. Absolutely. Where I need an easy rig. Or I'm going to have something that I get the focal length range is narrower, where I get more speed, but I'm not going to be able to punch in where I want to. So it's going to be lens, it's going to be potentially weight in terms of flexibility. The Z280 is a little more smaller and compact, so that's going to have a bearing in it as well. But also things like car. I filmed in cars and with very restricted space, where the FS7 can be a little bit bulky, that sort of stuff. And also possibly more when I'm doing my lighting, possibly more when I'm doing my sort of more stylized stuff. The Super 35mm sensor might just pip to the post, just because there is a little bit more material, a bit of information coming in.
Is it going to be as simple as narrative controlled environments, large sensor, documentary, uncontrolled environments? This Z280?
Yeah, no, quite possibly. I mean, I think there'll be two things. I think one is you will have those loyal to their FS7s or loyal to, so they will stick with that, and that's fine. But when the decision-making process is made, I mean, this film I was doing last week for Channel 4, all the observational documentary stuff, all the stuff done with the sort of kitchen staff and crawling around after the cockroaches, all done beautifully on a Z280. Perfect in low light. They didn't film log, they shot SDR. They've got the lens. They can put the camera down. That's one of the issues sometimes with the FS7. Putting the camera down, you want it flat and level. So all that side of stuff. She was filming in a car as well, so nice and compact. I then came on board and shot with the FS7 for all the more sort of contributor pieces to camera-led stuff.
I see.
And that was shot with an FS7 with Canon EF lenses. I'm used to the FS7 more than the Z280, only because the former's been out longer than the latter.
Sure, you've been using it for longer.
Yeah, and I might well be tempted in the future to actually go down the Z280 route. I didn't last week because I know I was recording in very low light as well with some of the contributors, and we were sort of doing stuff with neon signs, and I just thought the Super 35mm sensor might have just given me a little bit more dynamic range. Now that might be my naivety.
Well, no, I think it's very true, and I think there's going to be that middle ground of production, which is probably exactly what you're describing, which is controlled interviews and things like that as a main structure, but with then lots of obdoc B-roll over the top, essentially, where a team of both cameras is going to be perfect. It's going to be the best of both worlds, literally.
I agree, and I think there is probably just a line in the middle where you can say one for one, one for the other.
Yeah.
And that's fine, but I think there's going to be a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
But certainly if I was making a decision in terms of buying a camera, I would be thinking very, very carefully. And I don't know two cameras that have given me such similar images, have both been on the market at the same time, when that choice has been there. It's going to be an interesting sort of next 6 to 12 months to see what happens.
I think it's only a good thing, really, isn't it? I mean, I see so often talking to customers that they try and shoehorn a camera that isn't really designed for the sort of work that they do into the sort of work that they do and go, oh, how can I make this work?
Yeah.
Whereas when Sony are giving options like this, which are essentially very, very similar cameras, but designed for different use cases, you're going to be able to pick the right tool for your job. You're not going to have to compromise and faff about trying to make something work.
No, absolutely. And when I've been thinking about where they go with the FS7, what are they going to do to it to change it? What's going to come out next? I couldn't actually think of anything because I thought it would be an FS7 derivative. It would be a Mark III or whatever. But they've changed completely and they've brought out something that does something similar. But as we've been discussing, it appeals to different markets for different reasons, different jobs for different reasons.
Absolutely.
And I can see one selling just as well as the other. Because with the Z280 as well, I should imagine it will probably appeal to news as well.
Oh, hugely.
Because you've got this, again, I think we've spoken about in terms of the codec and the lens and so on and so on. But you've got XDCam Air, which is the great thing coming up, which I keep banging on to all my documentary clients about. I mean, this ability to send material back so the editor can be working on it. It takes me back to my days at the BBC when it was neg cutting. We would film negative film, but you wouldn't touch that for months till you got to the final cut at the end. But the card, I think, will become like that, where we shoot on the card, stored on your hard drive, but we don't necessarily use it. We use what's been sent back.
Yeah.
So there's all those possibilities, which is terribly exciting for people like me. And I've been doing this 35 years now, but I still think the choice is much greater than ever it was before. I think at the beginning with film, we had the ability to do everything I referred to earlier in terms of faithfully recording your colour and your contrast, and could do it beautifully. The end of film, the bell was rung because of the cost and everything that was involved in film. And then we went in a bit of a dip when the video technology came out. But I remember all the issues with not having to blast everything with light, zero contrast. And for us as practitioners, we had a cable that connected the camera to the recorder. Yeah. So the car was coming towards you, one went one way, one went the other, you had it sort of thing. Yeah. And that lasted for, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And it wasn't great for us slightly frustrated cinematographers that have been used to using my Super 8 film, but then subsequent the 16mm film. And it was always that battle to get back to what we had. And it is, yes, the sensor has allowed us to do that with all its amazing potential of your contrast and your colour and your depth of field. But there's obviously a hell of a lot more going on to the cameras. My film cameras had one button. You pushed it one way, it went on. You pushed it the other, it went off. Look at the side of all these cameras now. You don't need all those buttons necessarily. I'm a great fan of the war photographer Don McCullum, and he's an elderly gentleman now, but I go to lots of his talks. And someone in the audience back 2 or 3 months ago said to him, "Do you have names for your cameras, Dom? Do I thought it was a very strange question. In fact, he had to ask twice for the question. But what he said was so profound. He said, I don't have names for my cameras. Mm-hmm. In fact, the camera isn't the most important thing. It's what's here. And then he hit himself on he said it's the gut. It's my gut feeling. It's my instinct.
They are tools.
They are tools. And I am instinctive. I like to think I'm instinctive with all the filming I do. Mm. If someone's getting emotional, sticking by a window, that silhouette, it works for us. In my recording studio, that's on BBC One at the moment, because there's moments of great joy when they're singing something for, how do I reflect that in my lighting? Mm. So all of it has to come from the gut feeling. What feels right in the soul?
Absolutely.
All I want from the kit is for it to translate that.
Yeah, enable you.
That enablement to actually harness what I'm thinking. And that's what Don McCullum was saying. That's what, if I can compare myself with him, that's all I want my camera to do. But we're getting there now with the cameras. And if we have a little bit of overlap, that's fine. That's more choice. And we just need to take everybody with us in terms of those that hire us, those that buy the cameras, so they are fully understanding of what this amazing bit of kit with all its buttons will allow us to do. But at the same time, the implications for knock-on. Yeah. Because a choice made now with one of these cameras can potentially have knock-on all the way through the system.
Yeah. Right, that's absolutely fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
No chance, Carl. It's great to be here and great to be here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.
So if you want to buy any of the products we've talked about so far, the links to them are down in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.